You're listening to the Fresh Hell podcast. Fresh Hell contains stories of a disturbing and often graphic nature and is intended for a mature audience. Please don't let your kids listen to this, or they might turn out like us.
Hi, I'm Annie from Massachusetts.
And I'm Johanna from Austria, and you're listening to your favorite international podcast. The podcast hosted by two women who've never met, because meeting in person might just break the spell.
That's right. Before we start, we'd love to give a shout out to our newest Patreon members. They are Michelle Graft, my dog Rocky smells of dog, which amazing. Tell Rocky we said hi. And Rebecca Eschbach. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you. And of course, a huge shout out and big thank you to all of our other Patreon members and everyone else who supports our weird little podcast in whatever way you can. You're the reason this podcast keeps going and why our search histories are even remotely justifiable. I mean, in all seriousness, though, we're very grateful for every single one of you who've joined us on Patreon. You help us cover the research rabbit holes, the hosting fees, and the occasional existential dread snack. I ate too much candy. It's fine. And in return, we give you early access to episodes, bonus content, and our eternal appreciation in this world and the next. So if you haven't joined yet and you want to support the show, now is a great time. You can find all of the details at patreon.com/freshhellpodcast. So come hang out with the rest of our hellions. It's cozy, weird, and, mildly cursed. It's fine. This is all fine. Now it's time to continue the story of the Tylenol murders, which, since last week, so many people I know in real life have been super excited that we are covering this because they remember it.
Yeah, and so many people even from the Chicago area at the time.
Absolutely. So, Johanna, you want to give us just the quickest reminder of what we've already talked about?
Yes, my pleasure. But as always, if you haven't listened to part 1, you might want to go and do that now so you know what's even going on if you're not familiar with the case. So this is Chicago area, late September, early October 1982. It all started with 12-year-old Mary Kellerman, who took a Tylenol for a cold and never woke up. That same day, Adam Janus collapsed and died, followed by his brother Stanley and sister-in-law Teresa, after all three had taken Tylenol from the same bottle. Within days, 3 more people would die the same way. Mary McFarland, who was a young single mom on her break at work, Mary Reiner, a 27-year-old who had just given birth to her 4th child a week earlier, and Paula Prince, a flight attendant found dead in her Chicago apartment. All victims had one thing in common: Tylenol extra-strength capsules laced with potassium cyanide. Panic spread fast, not only in Chicago but nationwide. Pharmacies yanked Tylenol off the shelves, police warned residents to throw away their bottles, Johnson & Johnson pulled 31 million bottles and no one knew who was behind it or how many more people might be at risk. The product wasn't faulty, it had been tampered with either before or after it left the factory. And back in 1982, there were no tamper-proof seals. You just twisted the cap and trusted whatever was inside. Today, we're going to be digging into the massive investigation, the prime suspects, the ransom note, and the way this case reshaped consumer safety forever. Also, we're going to get a little bit more into the Johnson & Johnson, how they pulled the 31 million bottles, what they did.
Very smart. And we already talked about this a bit last week, but we think it's super important for everyone to really, really understand this bit. If you were alive in 1982, chances are there was a bottle of Tylenol in the medicine cabinet. Before this case, it was America's most trusted pain reliever by far. Roughly 35% of the over-the-counter painkiller market belonged to Tylenol. Johnson & Johnson had turned acetaminophen into a household staple. But in the span of these few days in the fall of 1982, that red and white bottle went from comforting to terrifying. And we mentioned briefly how Johnson & Johnson dealt with the whole situation because they were really in quite the pickle. First of all, there was the big question. Was this a production error? Were the bottles tampered with after production, for example, by a disgruntled employee? Or did it happen after the bottles had left the factory? These are all really good questions, and the police could answer them pretty quickly because investigators from the FDA, the Illinois Attorney General's office, and the FBI were all looking at this case from every possible angle. And what they found ruled out contamination at the source, so it wasn't happening in the factory. First of all, let's talk about the bottles that killed the victims, because they didn't all come from the same place. Some were manufactured at a Johnson & Johnson plant in Pennsylvania, others in Texas. They were completely different production lots. If the poison had gotten in during manufacturing, it would have shown up in a single lot code, and you'd have seen deaths all over the country. But here, all of the victims were in and around Chicago. That pointed to something local and something deliberate. Then there was the way the poisoned bottles were distributed. Victims had bought Tylenol from all different stores: Walgreens, Jewel, Frank's Finer Foods, Osco Drug. These weren't sister companies sharing a warehouse. These were totally separate stores in different neighborhoods. And that made one thing clear. This wasn't happening in transit or in a distribution center. Someone had physically placed the poisoned bottles on the store shelves, likely purchasing them, then tampering with them at home, and then putting them back for unsuspecting shoppers. And here's another important detail. Every victim had taken Tylenol capsules, not tablets. Capsules are those soft, sort of gelatin-covered pills that you can pull apart and fill with powder. Say, potassium cyanide, that's a powder, and then snap it shut again. You wouldn't even notice. Tablets, on the other hand, are compressed and solid and way harder to tamper with cleanly. So whoever did this knew what they were doing, and they picked the form of medication that was the easiest to tamper with without setting off any red flags. And finally, when federal investigators swabbed and tested Johnson & Johnson's plants and packaging facilities, they didn't find a single trace of cyanide. Nothing. No loose powder, no residue, no faulty equipment. The supply chain was clean, which meant the poisoning had to happen after the bottles left the factory. So, with no contamination at the source, no overlap in distribution, and all the signs pointing to deliberate, local tampering, the case turned from a public health crisis into a homicide investigation.
So once law enforcement and FDA officials confirmed that the Tylenol deaths were not the results of a manufacturing error, but as you said, deliberate, and because they were tampered with, Johnson & Johnson faced the biggest crisis in its corporate history. And it didn't matter that the product had been sabotaged after the production. It was their name on the label. And 7 people were dead, and the panic was spreading fast. And the next step could make or break the company. So on 5th of October 1982, Johnson & Johnson made the decision to recall every bottle of extra-strength Tylenol capsules across the United States. Not just the lots that were linked to the death in Chicago, not just Illinois, all of it. Even though the tampering was limited to a small number of stores in the Chicago area, the company didn't take any chances. The recall cost Johnson & Johnson an estimated $100 million, and that's in 1982 dollars. Today, that would be closer to $300 million when you adjust for inflation.
That's a lot of money.
It's a lot. It's you know.
Yeah, that's horse on carpet money. Like, you have a stable of racehorses, and each of the stalls has its own individual carpet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I don't think it was just a financial hit. I mean, ultimately it was, because they had to regain public trust in a product that had suddenly become a symbol of random death. The risk wasn't just to Tylenol, though. It was the entire brand, and arguably to the entire concept of over-the-counter medication in the US. I can't even begin to imagine how damaging this would be to a brand, especially in the pharma sector.
Yeah, the way they handled everything here is truly remarkable, because you would think that this would be the end of any company, right? Like you would just lose faith, but they're still trusted. So how? How did it all go down?
Yeah, and they knew they had to act very quickly. Within a week of the first death, Johnson & Johnson was sending representatives out to the media. They were appearing on the nightly news. They were explaining what they knew and what they were doing to keep the public safe. So they tried to be very transparent or appear very transparent. They also set up a toll-free hotline. And again, this was 1982. So this was not standard operating procedure. And people could call in to report suspicious bottles or ask questions. They offered to replace any Tylenol capsules with tablets which were not affected. And they ran full-page ads in major newspapers telling people not to take Tylenol. There were also radio PSAs, press conferences, and direct cooperation with the FDA and law enforcement. And then there was the now legendary move that has become part of business school lore. They did stop talking about the brand and they started focusing on the victims. Every public message from Johnson & Johnson focused on the families who lost someone. On the fear people were feeling, on the responsibility of the company, that they had to do the right thing, even though the tampering wasn't technically their fault. And I think the combination of all of these measures, that's the reason why it worked. The CEO at the time, James Burke, made a point of appearing transparent and proactive. In one interview, he told reporters, quote, "We can only do what we think is right, and pulling every bottle is the right thing." End quote. I think it sounds a little bit obvious now, like we're all like, duh, what else would you do? But at the time, it was kind of groundbreaking. Most companies in the 1980s didn't operate like that. I mean, the 1980s was kind of the heyday of covering up
That's right.
environmental catastrophes and these kind of things, right?
Yeah.
I think the normal strategy would have been to limit liability, avoid admissions, and just hope it will blow all over. And instead, Johnson & Johnson, they took the hit and they came out with the reputation intact.
They really did. As I said, Tylenol is still considered the most trusted brand, or certainly among the most trusted, and it worked. It worked.
Yeah. But we also have to say it wasn't all perfect. Initially, the company did issue a smaller scale recall focusing on specific lot numbers. And it wasn't until more deaths were found out and more bottles were found to be tampered with that they expanded it to the national level. There was a little bit of lag time. There were some missteps, but overall, I think the consensus, even among critics, was that Johnson & Johnson handled the crisis better than anyone expected.
And then came the packaging changes. Johnson & Johnson became one of the first companies to introduce tamper-evident packaging. Their redesigned bottles included multiple layers of protection: a glued-shut box flap, a plastic neckband, and a foil seal over the mouth of the bottle. These now might feel like really basic stuff, but in 1982, it was a revolution. Within months, other companies followed suit, and in 1983, the U.S. Congress passed the Federal Anti-Tampering Act, making it a federal offense to tamper with consumer products and giving the FDA new oversight powers. The packaging standards we all take for granted today, the shrink wrap, the click-to-open caps, those inner seals that you can't get like a thumbnail in, or you have to get out a sharp knife and get stabby with it, all of that goes right back to this case. And Johnson & Johnson didn't just change their packaging. They changed their entire marketing strategy. When Tylenol capsules were reintroduced in 1983, they launched a massive campaign to reassure the public. These new bottles were safe, the product was safe, and their priority was consumer trust. They even offered coupons and deep discounts to encourage people to try the new packaging. Within a year, Tylenol had regained the majority of its market share. That would have seemed unthinkable in the days right after the murders, but it happened. And that's why even now, the case is referenced anytime there's a product recall, from contaminated lettuce to faulty airbags. The quote-unquote Tylenol recall has become corporate shorthand for getting ahead of a crisis with transparency and speed.
really remarkable, I think, to get out of this kind of situation.
Yeah, and I know there
unscathed.
were some delays at the beginning, like you had just mentioned earlier, but we also have to remember that they were figuring out what was going on while everyone else was figuring out what was going on. It wasn't a situation where, because this does happen sometimes, right, where there's a problem at the plant, and it was something that they screwed up on. They were legitimately in the dark as much as everyone else and trying to figure out what was going on.
It all came down to investigators, right? To the investigators. So let's talk about the investigation for a little bit. By 1st of October, the case was no longer just a local Chicago tragedy. It had become a national crisis, and so it was time to bring in the big guns. So the FBI got involved almost immediately, and they joined forces with the Illinois Attorney General's office, the FDA, the local police departments, and also Johnson & Johnson's internal investigators. It became one of the largest task forces of its kind at the time, with more than 100 agents and detectives working around the clock. And they were able to trace the tainted Tylenol capsules using the lot numbers printed on the bottles, and as Annie said before, the contaminated capsules didn't come from a single factory. They came from multiple production plants, so at least 2, I think, one in Pennsylvania and the one in Texas. So what did that mean? It meant someone, presumably a local, had purchased the Tylenol capsules, opened the bottles, pulled apart the gelatin capsules, added potassium cyanide carefully, then carefully reassembled them and returned the bottles to the store shelves. It also meant they did this not in one pharmacy, but in several different retail locations. A Walgreens here, a Jewel Osco there, even a little independent grocery store. One of our listeners said something very interesting to me, that one of the stores where they found, where one of the victims had bought the tampered bottles, was actually in a railway station. So that was pretty lucky that it wasn't kind of spread further. Because, you're kind of on your way from work, you just swing by the store, you grab a bottle of Tylenol, and it goes, you don't even know where. The FBI and police departments were left trying to reconstruct a crime scene that didn't exist in one place. Instead, they had to work backwards from each victim. Where did they buy their Tylenol? When? From which store? And whether there had been an unusual return or refund in the days leading up to it. Investigators visited pharmacies across the Chicago area. They collected every bottle of Tylenol they could get their hands on. They interviewed store clerks, combed through sales records, and asked customers if they remembered anything suspicious, anything odd. But the trail was cold before it even started. There were almost no security cameras in stores back then. I think Paula Prince was caught on a security camera purchasing her bottle of Tylenol, if I remember correctly.
That sounds right.
But yeah, that was an exception.
Yeah.
They had no digital payment records. They found no fingerprints on the bottles.
This is also the kind of thing, though, isn't it, where whoever was doing this, you can imagine it would not have actually been that difficult, because all you had to do was have that little bottle of Tylenol in your pocket, go to the store. You could literally leave it anywhere, and people working at the store would see it and put it back with the Tylenol.
Exactly.
You wouldn't even have to be near the aisle. You know what I mean? It's so devious.
Because they would just assume a customer
picked it up and left
to buy it,
That's
and then
right.
changed their mind.
All the time.
Left it anywhere. Yeah. So the case was massive. Every clue was chased down. Dozens, I think hundreds of tips came in about people behaving strangely in drugstores, about suspicious returns, about, that one guy from work who always talked about poison a little bit too much. Couldn't be us.
Not us, what?
So there were rumors, there were red herrings, people with chemistry degrees, people who'd recently lost their loved ones to illness, people who just gave off a weird vibe. They were all suspects now. But there was nothing solid. And the problem was also, why? Why would someone poison random, unconnected people? And then came the ransom letter.
Just days after the final Tylenol victim, Paula Prince, was discovered, a letter arrived at Johnson & Johnson's corporate headquarters. It was postmarked from Chicago and signed by someone calling himself Robert Richardson. The message was chilling. The author claimed responsibility for the poisonings and demanded $1 million be wired to a specific bank account to make the killings stop. And we have the letter here. Johnson & Johnson, parent of McNeil Laboratories. Quote, "Gentlemen, as you can see, it is easy to place cyanide, both potassium and sodium, into capsules sitting on store shelves. And since the cyanide is inside the gelatin, it is easy to get buyers to swallow the bitter pill. Another beauty is that cyanide operates quickly. It takes so very little, and there will be no time to take countermeasures. If you don't mind the publicity of these little capsules, then do nothing. So far, I have spent less than $50, and it takes me less than 10 minutes per bottle. If you want to stop the killing, then wire $1 million to bank account blah 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 at Central Illinois Bank, Chicago, Illinois. Don't attempt to involve the FBI or local Chicago authorities with this letter. A couple of phone calls by me will undo anything you can possibly do." End quote. So that's fun. And this wasn't the first time a major company had received a threat like this, but it was the first time in a case like this where the death toll had already hit 7. And this one had details that just felt too close to home. The method of tampering, the use of cyanide, even the claim that more bottles were just out there waiting. By the way, apparently when the bottles were recalled, they did find a few other bottles that had been tampered with as well, at least 3, and who knows how many more might have existed, because I'm sure there were people who bought Tylenol, didn't bother with the recall, just threw them away.
Yeah, exactly.
It's why Johnson & Johnson told people to throw away every single bottle, not just the ones from specific lot numbers. The risk was everywhere, and the only way to be safe was to assume that any and every bottle could be the next one.
You know what? I'm also just thinking, like, when I travel to the United States, for example, or travel to other countries, I often, as a tourist, pop into the pharmacy and buy a bottle of whatever, pain relief. I don't know, different things.
I do too.
If that would have been an area where it's more likely that tourists come, that could have, the bottle could have ended up in Europe, in Asia, in wherever.
Oh, this could have been a worldwide catastrophe.
There would have been no way to even know or connect those things in the 1980s.
Nope.
Scary.
It is scary. I do the same thing. Yeah, when I'm in Europe, there are certain things I want to buy. Every time we're in Mexico, there's certain things I want to buy. Yeah. It's interesting what's kept behind the counter and what's available for over the counter is different in every country. Yeah.
So different.
Yeah.
So obviously the FBI took the ransom letter very seriously, and when agents examined the envelope under infrared light, they spotted a faint imprint from a postage meter. Not just any postage meter, but one registered to a travel agency in New York City, where a woman named Leanne Lewis just so happened to work. And as it turns out, Leanne was the wife of a man named James W. Lewis. And he's going to be the only person ever convicted in connection to the 1982 poisonings. Not for murder, oh no, but for extortion. However, his connection to the case has made him a focal point for investigators, for filmmakers, for conspiracy theorists, and everybody who's interested in ever solving this case. So, he was born in March of 1944 in Memphis, Tennessee, but was raised in Carl Junction, Missouri after being adopted. His early life wasn't rosy. By his early 20s, he was institutionalized for attacking his adoptive mother with an axe, a violent episode that landed him in a mental institution in 1968. He rebuilt a life as a tax preparer and accountant, but ran into legal trouble again. In 1978, Lewis was charged in Kansas City with the murder of a tax client, Raymond West, though that charge fell apart amid dispute.
Yeah, this guy is a problem.
Then he's a problem, yeah. Then he was indicted again in 1981 for credit card fraud, a case that landed him probation after prosecutors said he had used a client's name to open multiple cards.
Oh boy.
But his criminal past was not the only thing that made him such a perfect suspect in the Tylenol murder. He was also holding a quiet, very personal grudge. In 1974, his young daughter died suddenly after her congenital heart surgery. Lewis believed blame lay with Johnson & Johnson, which made the surgical sutures used in her procedure.
Yeah, so he's blaming Johnson & Johnson for the loss of his child, but the difficulty is that he has such a clear history of violent mental illness that, it's just sad.
Yeah. So, okay, they have this letter. They make all the connections back to Lewis' wife. They also realize that Lewis also had used his old alias, Robert Richardson, previously seen in other crooked schemes. And the bank account he demanded payment into, that one was linked to one of his former clients. He'd set everything up to be traced back to him.
That's right. Not exactly the sort of mastermind capable of perpetrating these particular crimes. So by October 1982, agents had their lead. They thought they had collected enough evidence for a warrant. But unfortunately, by the time they tracked all of this, Lewis had disappeared. He went on the run for almost 2 months, surfacing in New York City under a different name. The FBI finally caught up with him. He was finally like, oh, maybe I should pick a different fake name this time. Maybe I should stop using the same fake name for all my crimes and branch out and choose a different one. Smart guy. And so, they finally caught him at the public library of all places, where he was found reading news coverage of the very case he was now the center of. It's almost like if somebody wrote that, you'd almost say oh, that's silly. No one would believe that. He didn't resist his arrest. He told agents he was just trying to draw attention to corporate corruption. He admitted to writing the letter, but denied having anything to do with the actual poisonings. According to him, it was a hoax, a stunt, an attempt to expose flaws in Johnson & Johnson's system. He was charged and later convicted of attempted extortion. He served just over 12 years. But remember, he could never be linked to the actual murders. So despite how suspicious he looked, despite having both motive and method and opportunity, there was never any direct evidence tying James Lewis to the tampered Tylenol bottles. He was never seen near any of the stores where the tainted capsules were sold. None of his prints were found on any of the bottles. No one saw him buy Tylenol. No one saw him return Tylenol. There were no receipts, no witnesses, no smoking gun. So yes, he's guilty of threatening Johnson & Johnson, but he was never charged with actual murder.
His story gets even a little bit crazier because shortly after his arrest, yes, I said that, he mailed another letter, this time to President Ronald Reagan, threatening to use a remote-controlled model plane to disrupt the White House. Because, why should he stop at corporate extortion when you can threaten the President of the United States, right?
Right. It's such a weird threat, too.
It's so crazy. This sounds crazy. He's in jail threatening the president.
With a modeled plane. Yeah, I'm just going to harass you. Like the snipers on the roof wouldn't be, poof, gone,
Yeah, he keeps sending threatening letters from jail where he landed for sending threatening letters.
Yeah, he's just he's clearly mentally ill. There's no... Yeah.
According to court documents, Lewis sounded at least serious enough that the Secret Service got involved. Obviously, they have to take it serious.
Oh, yeah.
In a way. That letter was catalogued under attempted extortion. My guess is he wanted attention. As you said, he was probably mentally very unwell. And he definitely got a lot of attention. He didn't just vanish from controversy after prison. He kept contacting the FBI after his release, offering to help solve the Tylenol murders.
They were thrilled. They were like, wow, thanks.
Yeah. Occasionally, he also granted rare interviews describing the 1982 investigation as disgraceful, and he insisted he was not the killer, and he claimed he just wanted to expose the weakness in products and systems. He also said that they will never find the real murderer, and they are looking in I think, quote unquote, he said, they are barking up the wrong tree.
Mm.
In 2009, the case was reopened. They were now using modern forensic techniques, DNA and fingerprint, all the things that didn't exist in the 1980s. They resubmitted evidence from the Tylenol bottles, capsules, and the labels for testing, and that's how they found some DNA sample.
So investigators also went back to Lewis again, and they searched his home here in Massachusetts. Yes, that's right, my neck of the woods. And they re-questioned him. They took DNA and looked for new connections using modern forensic tech. Still nothing. Then, in July 2023, Lewis died in his Cambridge home. He was 79. And you know how we're always sort of hoping for a deathbed confession? Yeah, he didn't give us one. There was nothing. No flash of murder confession, no final key revealing the Tylenol killer. Just silence, and that's the frustrating part. He might be the guy, he might not. He's the best suspect we've got, and still nothing definitive has ever stuck. That's why, even now, people argue he could be the murderer, or nothing more than a dangerous narcissist who hijacked this national nightmare for attention.
I mean, he definitely had a motive. His anger at Johnson & Johnson for the death of his daughter.
I agree. I really don't think he was ever a real suspect. Like, in my eyes, it seems very clear that this is just somebody who had
like a personal vendetta, and he just used his opportunity.
Well, it's almost like all of his issues are based on delusions, right? Because he's deluded into thinking that the problem was Johnson & Johnson, why his daughter died. And he was deluded into thinking that he could somehow help them. Like calling the FBI after you've gotten out of prison to say, I can help, like clearly unwell.
I mean, he attacked his adoptive mother with an axe.
Violent, yeah. He attacked didn't he also kill a coworker or something? He was a violent, problematic person, but not
a client, but it was kind of dropped, so we don't know if he did or didn't. He's not the only suspect, of course. There was another name that surfaced early on, Roger Arnold. He was a 40-year-old dock worker at Jewel Osco warehouse in Melrose Park. He hadn't been on anyone's radar before, but then one local bar owner told police that Arnold had been bragging about buying cyanide around March of 1982. He must have been overheard talking about it from the bar stools of the Lincoln Park Tavern, and that was a comment so strange that someone thought, I think I should call the police and tell them about it. That tip was enough for authorities to subpoena a search warrant, and on 11th of October, detectives went to Arnold's apartment, and inside, they found something you wouldn't expect. It was a collection of weapons. I think it was 5 guns in total. It was a chemistry set of beakers and test tubes, and even a copy of the poor man's James Bond. This is a handbook that included instructions on synthesizing cyanide. Arnold later admitted he'd possessed cyanide at home at one point, but when the police tested those powders and vials, the lab results showed potassium carbonate, not potassium cyanide. The crazy thing about him, or the interesting thing about him, is that Arnold had worked at the same warehouse as Mary Reiner's father, linking him indirectly to one of the victims. I think this is some crazy 6 degrees of separation kind of situation here, right? Is it 6 degrees?
Yeah, I agree. This one is interesting.
Another interesting connection, his wife, so Arnold's wife, had been treated around the corner from where Mary Reiner had bought her fatal bottle at the Central DuPage Hospital. But as investigators dug deeper, nothing more concrete came to light. No purchase records, no receipts, no credible timeline that placed him at the pharmacy in question. And despite refusing a polygraph test, Arnold pleaded his case. He denied any involvement, saying he had no connection to the poisonings, and then in 1983 he was charged with an unrelated homicide. Arnold shot a man he believed had tipped off the police on him during the Tylenol investigation. The man he killed was a man named John Stanisher. He was a 46-year-old computer consultant and a father of 3, and he was just walking home with friends. He was not the person who had talked to the police. Arnold had simply mistaken him for someone else, and he just shot him. Arnold was arrested and confessed to the killing, and he said it was revenge, but it was obviously misplaced anger at a completely innocent person. In January 1984, Arnold was convicted of the murder and sentenced to 30 years, of which he served about 15. 15 years.
That is so infuriating because
it is.
this is somebody just by the things that he's done, dangerous. Like,
Very dangerous.
That person should be locked up forever. That's not.
Yeah.
And I know all of the suspects are people with clear mental illness, because obviously you would have to be unwell in order to think about doing this in the first place. But 15 years, his poor family, if they're listening to this,
She's the father of 3 children who just walks by a bar, and this guy, Arnold, is standing outside and thinking, that's the guy who kind of snitched me out to the police.
It wasn't even the right guy.
So let's shoot him. Even though he was not even, he was not charged for it. There was nothing. It was a done deal for him.
Yeah. It's very upsetting. It's very, very upsetting. And I'm really angry on behalf of his family.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah.
So in 2010, Arnold had already passed away at the time. His body was exhumed for the DNA testing, and his DNA didn't match any from the tainted Tylenol bottles neither. So Arnold turns out to be at another tragic dead end, violent, so violent, super erratic and very suspicious, but probably not the Tylenol killer.
There was one other name that surfaced, Lori Dan. She wasn't a suspect in 1982, but years later, when she became infamous for a deadly school shooting in Winnetka, Illinois, in 1988, people looked back and wondered. Dan had a long history of serious mental illness, obsessive behaviors, and crucially, access to poison. In the weeks before her attack, she mailed baked goods and juice boxes laced with arsenic and cyanide to acquaintances and strangers. So yeah, once her story came to light, people naturally asked if she might have been connected to the Tylenol case. But no, there was no evidence, no connection to the stores, the victims, or the bottles, and the timeline didn't quite work. So there was nothing to tie her to what happened in Chicago that fall. Then we have Kevin Masterson, a 35-year-old mechanic from Lombard. He had a long-standing grudge against 2 different grocery stores. Just that sentence, what kind of a problematic person do you have to be feuding with grocery stores, right? So yeah, there were 2 grocery stores that Kevin had beef with. One was called Jewel and the other was Frank's Finer Foods, both of which had sold poisoned bottles. The reason he was angry with them is that his wife had been frisked by store security. We're not saying she was trying to put meat down her pants, but who can say? And so he told his friends, quote, now is the time to even the score. Even saying, quote, son of Sam will pale by comparison. He was convinced that this incident ultimately led to their divorce. So there was definitely a motive there. There's so much to unpack there. His wife was...
I'm not laughing because it's fun. I'm laughing because I'm really thinking, who are these people?
Who are these people? Exactly. So this guy, it seems like his wife had been accused of shoplifting by store security and frisked. And I've been through that. I think I told you that story once previously about the time I was mistakenly picked up for shoplifting in a Walmart, of all places. And he was furious about this, but somehow this also led to their divorce. Or his mental illness thinks that was the start of the problem, I guess. But these people. So Masterson actually was wanted for questioning, but he could not be found. He was then arrested, but not for this, for possession of cannabis. This is from the Redlands Daily Facts, Wednesday, December 1st, 1982, page 2. Quote, Masterson goes berserk. Los Angeles. Kevin Masterson, who surrendered to the FBI for questioning in the Chicago Tylenol poisonings, went berserk and was transferred to a padded cell, police said today. He went berserk last night in his cell about 7 p.m., Lieutenant Daniel Cook said. He got angry. He said he heard other prisoners referring to him as the Tylenol killer. Cook said Masterson smashed the commode in his cell and smeared defecation on the walls. Masterson, who faced arraignment today on an unrelated narcotics charge, and a probable speedy return to Illinois for lie detector tests, was transferred to a padded cell for the rest of the night. He was calm this morning, Cook said. End quote. And then there's a picture of Kevin Masterson, and he looks... Who's that doctor on Scrubs?
Oh, yeah. What was his name? The mean one.
Yeah, that's who would play him in the made-for-TV movie.
He looks pretty high.
He does.
Yeah.
He does. So, police searched his apartment and they found 2 extra-strength Tylenol capsules, but there was no cyanide in them. So this was just another dead end, and investigators closed the book on him.
I read somewhere, and I don't know if it's true because I couldn't find the source for it, but I read that his father worked somewhere where he would have easy access to cyanide in a way. So that also made him kind of suspicious. But anyway, then there was Ted Kaczynski. The Unabomber, he had ties to Chicago before his bombing spree in the 1980s, and he had access to chemicals including cyanide. Both killing sprees, so Kaczynski's killing spree and the Tylenol murders, they required a technical mind and a willingness to kill at random, which, Ted Kaczynski definitely had. But once Kaczynski was finally arrested in 1996 and his vast stash of writings and plans were uncovered, nothing pointed to Tylenol. However, in 2011, the FBI even asked Kaczynski for a DNA sample to compare it to the DNA sample found on one of the Tylenol bottles. But guess what? He refused to participate. And that sounds pretty on brand for him, I think.
Yeah, the Unabomber, he's not a joiner. I know the Unabomber theory. I think a lot of people really buy into that conspiracy theory. We didn't really fall down too deeply into that rabbit hole, but I'd be interested to hear if any of our listeners have thoughts on the Unabomber theory.
Maybe that's wrong of me, but do you have the same thing where if there's one famous or infamous murderer or infamous criminal, and then always people will try to connect it to unsolved cases, right?
That's
Which makes sense. But then I'm also like, what are the chances that this person also did this infamous murder spree? Like, what are the chances that H.H. Holmes was the Ripper?
Yeah. Right. Well, because you'd think that they would confess as well. Like, there would be,
true.
For most of these people, it would be a feather in their cap to be recognized as the person that created all this extra havoc. So, yeah.
You know what else was such a big problem and further made investigations so hard? Copycats. And hoaxes, we can't forget the hoaxes. The Tylenol murders didn't only trigger the national panic, it also triggered a wave of copycats. In late 1982, the FDA started receiving reports from across the US of suspicious, sometimes violent tampering incidents. It wasn't just Tylenol anymore. Parents called poison control hotlines fretting over rat poison in baby aspirin, hydrochloric acid in cough syrup, laxatives, and even Halloween candy. Annie and I covered that one already.
That's right.
One man in Tacoma claimed to have found a syringe in a Pepsi can, the so-called needle hoax. This was a full 11 years after Tylenol, but still, it was driven by the same fear.
Yeah.
Do you remember that? The syringe hoax?
Vaguely, yes.
There were corporate ripple effects too. In 1986, Procter & Gamble's headache relief brand Ancaprin hit the shelves amid lingering memory of Tylenol, or the Tylenol scandal in a way. And soon enough, someone claimed to have put cyanide in those bottles too, specifying lot numbers and stores, and it prompted a national recall. And it was a hoax. But it destroyed the brand and it forced it to quietly disappear. The scale of copycat scares was staggering. The Smithsonian estimated that there were over 270 incidents of product tampering reported in the month and years after the Tylenol poisonings. Manufacturers saw sales plummet and some stores even shut down aisle sections while police swept through them. One of the most chilling cases involved Stella Nichol in 1988. She poisoned Excedrin capsules with deadly cyanide, killing her husband and inadvertently killing another woman, Sue Snow. And Stella Nichol's motive? Life insurance. Nichol was later sentenced to 90 years in prison, becoming the first person convicted under the federal product tampering laws passed after the Tylenol murders.
One of the few good things that came out of the Tylenol murders is what came next. The way it forced lawmakers, corporations, and consumers to wake up and reimagine safety, especially in the most mundane places, grocery aisles and medicine cabinets. The packaging, by the way, is also a legacy of this case. In 1989, the FDA made tamper-evident packaging mandatory for all over-the-counter medications. The rules require at least one barrier that would, quote, provide visible evidence, end quote, of tampering, and most manufacturers added multiple layers. So the shrink band around the bottle cap, sealed blister packs, glued shut boxes, all the things that we've sort of mentioned, they're not just annoying, they're life-saving. It's why decades later, you still see the phrase, do not use if seal is broken, stamped on virtually everything from mouthwash to muscle rub. So now that you know that whenever you're opening a bottle of pills and you have to claw your way through a foil seal, a glued box flap, plastic shrink bands, or all three, this case is the reason why. Also, before 1982, there were no federal statutes that specifically addressed product tampering. None. At the time of the murders, poisoning a random consumer wasn't even considered a federal crime unless it crossed state lines. And in this case, horrifying as it was, didn't fit neatly into any existing criminal code. There was no clear legal route to pursue federal murder charges. That changed in 1983 when Congress passed what's known today as the Tylenol Bill. Officially, it amended Title 18 of the U.S. Code to make it a federal offense to tamper with consumer products. If someone intentionally alters a product and it causes death, that person can be charged with murder and face life in prison, as they should. It seems pretty simple, right?
Yeah, of course. I mean, what else would it be than murder?
Right. The bill also gave the FDA and FBI broader jurisdiction over these crimes, which helped to centralize and streamline future investigations. This bill was signed into law by President Ronald Reagan in 1983.
And now comes the unfortunate part that makes this case stick in our minds long after, or in your mind hopefully long after you post this episode. The Tylenol murders are still unsolved. It's a cold case, and many people think it's highly unlikely that it will ever be solved. Why weren't the killers caught? And were they a methodical saboteur? Or maybe someone who knew the victims? The biggest question for me is, what was the ultimate goal? Because we know that the extortion letter was probably not connected to the murders.
So suppose you are a calculated saboteur. You're dismantling a corporation or just looking to generate some fear. Poisoning random Tylenol bottles is messy. There's no guarantee or risk pays off. It suggests either a twisted ideology or maybe a personal vendetta. But as hard as they tried, nothing has been uncovered. If it was someone closer to the victims, a disgruntled employee, a revenge-driven acquaintance, you'd expect some kind of pattern, but the victims were spread across age, job, and location, and they had no overlap. It's just so random. Mary Reiner, Paula Prince, Mary Kellerman, Adam Stanley and Teresa Janis, Mary McFarland, these were normal lives, normal mornings, normal people just using Tylenol. Everyday bottles suddenly became fatal. What were we missing? Because something had to be missing, right?
Was this the work of a sick sadist, someone who just wanted to see if he could get away with murdering random, unconnected, innocent people? So I think we can't talk about the Tylenol murders without at least touching on some of the conspiracy theories that have been surrounding this case. And one of the big ones is that maybe, just maybe, Johnson & Johnson themselves were somehow behind it. I know that sounds like a lot, but the theory isn't that they deliberately poisoned anyone. It's more of an industrial accident cover-up scenario. Some versions claim the capsules might have been contaminated with the cyanide during the manufacturing process, probably accidentally or through negligence maybe, and that the company realized it too late. And according to this theory, they rushed into damage control mode and invented the story of a mysterious tamperer putting poisoned pills on store shelves. And I mean, I'm sorry, I'm usually not one for conspiracy theories, but I can totally see that happening. Tylenol was one of their biggest, if not their biggest, moneymaker. If production was actually to blame for the death of these 7 people, I don't think the brand could have ever recovered from that. Was that maybe the reason why Johnson & Johnson were so eager and forthcoming to immediately pull 31 million bottles of Tylenol? And I also have to say, money, because if you don't believe that and you're going to tell me, well, the lot numbers didn't match and it was produced in 2 different plants, yada, yada, yada. But money can make a lot of things disappear and a lot of things appear that weren't actually there. You know what I mean?
I do.
I'm not saying that's what happened, but I could see somewhere. I understand why people could believe this. Let's say it like this.
Agreed. When you look at it being something that Tylenol or Johnson & Johnson covered up, it's hard to imagine a situation in which cyanide would be part of production at any point. Like, it's not, you know what I mean? Like, if that were the case, I would almost feel like it was a calls coming from inside the house kind of situation where they had some disgruntled employee doing stuff. But we know that that's not what happened just because of where things were found.
But could it have been like, for example, like a Humbug Billy situation where they have like, I don't know, something went wrong with a provider, something was...
Could be,
I don't know. You know what I mean?
I do.
Did they receive something faulty and then it went into production without being checked?
Yeah. That would make more sense. Like if instead of whatever inert thing is added, it's cyanide.
Yeah.
Surprise.
Yeah.
I always wondered, my thought with this case, when I would think about it, it always seemed to me that this would be a very smart way to kill one intended target. So
absolutely, yeah.
If this somebody wanted to murder one of these people that were killed, maybe tampered with made sure, so they make all these bottles, they put a whole bunch on the shelf, and then maybe they put one in a medicine cabinet that they know might be used. I think that would be incredibly smart because the intended death might never even be noticed as anything other than this random tragedy, right?
Yeah.
But there's no proof
true.
of that, obviously. So it's just hard, isn't it, to wrap your head around why somebody would do this?
Why? I would understand if there were somebody trying to extort money out of Johnson & Johnson or whatever, but there was nothing, and then it just stopped.
Yeah.
And that would actually kind of play into your theory that it was one targeted victim and the others were just, unfortunately, collateral damage.
That's right.
Yeah. There's also another theory. I think this one is pushed by a former Johnson & Johnson employee. He self-published a book. And in this book, I didn't read it, but what I read about it is that he hints at the idea that someone inside the company may have sabotaged the product on purpose.
Right.
And you'll hear this referred to as the Tylenol Mafia theory. I think that's also the name of the book, the Tylenol Mafia. The idea being that it was all part of some twisted internal plot. I don't really understand what the goal would have been, like financial goal or revenge, or I don't know. I as I said, I didn't read the book.
I didn't read the book. Well, I just don't believe it. So if someone's read the book and thinks it's a really compelling case, please let us know. And maybe we'll give it a try. But
it's always the same with conspiracy theories, though. No, these theories persist because of the big unanswered questions. And in this case, if Johnson & Johnson didn't mess up and no one ever caught a suspect, then who did it?
Who was the killer? I think one big question is, how easy was it for everyday people in 1982 to get their hands on potassium cyanide, right?
Good question, yeah. That's a good point.
So it was not widely available to the general public, but it was significantly easy to obtain than it is today, especially if you had any kind of industrial, academic, or professional pretext. We found this article in the Washington Post. It's from October 4th, 1982, and it gave us a few answers to that question. Quote, "Few regulations limit cyanide's use or sale," by Felicity Barringer. Quote, The federal government, which controls the manufacture, importation, and distribution and sale of such dangerous items as guns, explosives, radioactive materials, and drugs, does little to keep track of the potent poison cyanide, and nothing to control its availability for sale to the public. Several agencies, from the Environmental Protection Agency to the Transportation Department, have some jurisdiction over the poison, which was apparently stuffed into extra-strength Tylenol capsules, killing 7 people in the Chicago area in the last 6 days. Most of the existing regulations, however, are geared to control the accidental release of the poison into the water or the atmosphere, either when the substance is being used in the manufacturing process, used in pesticide products, or disposed of in waste dumps. There are also rules designed to identify who has possession of the chemical when it is being transported from a manufacturer to a user. But once the cyanide arrives at its destination, those rules are no longer applicable. Officials at several federal agencies yesterday cited 2 arguments against attempting further regulation of cyanide and other poisons, like arsenic, that are frequently used in the industrial process. First, it is relatively easy for someone with the knowledge of chemistry to manufacture cyanide from a group of benign components. Second, it would be a mammoth job to regulate all available poisons. Quote, gasoline and a lot of other products are poisons, and they're not regulated either, said Bill Gregg, a spokesman for the Food and Drug Administration. There are so many potential poisons in the world, natural as well as manufactured, that if we decided they all needed to be regulated closely, it would be a monumental task. End quote. The most obvious existing authority for such regulation would be the 1976 Toxic Substances Control Act, which was designed as a catch-all piece of legislation, giving the EPA authority to regulate the use and distribution of dangerous substances not already controlled by existing legislation. Thus far, 4 substances have been regulated under the TSCA. Polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, once widely used in electrical generators, asbestos, chlorinated fluorocarbons, or aerosol propellants. Everybody remember the whole fight against CFCs and aerosols in the ozone layer in the 80s? And dioxin wastes resulting from different organic chemical processes. Quote, there's certainly no way under the Toxic Substances Control Act to keep track of individual possessions of poison, said Susan Vogt, a special assistant to the EPA's Assistant Administrator for Toxic Substances. You would have to control the sale of the substance in all instances.
Yeah, you would.
You would. Yeah.
Yes.
Please, can we?
Of course. Can we please?
Could we, if we could just know who has cyanide, that,
yeah,
I mean,
that would be
fine.
Awesome. That would be super.
That would be so helpful. The article continues. Cyanide is also subject to regulation by EPA under the Pesticide Control Act and by the Materials Transportation Bureau of the Transportation Department. It is not classified as a drug, a food, or a cosmetic, so it's not regulated by the FDA. According to John Slavic, a spokesman for the Chemical Manufacturers Association, there is no cradle-to-grave regulation of cyanide, as there is of radioactive materials, because the substances are so bad, and they have been recognized as being so bad, that the industry procedures in place have been proven through the course of time. If you fool around with this stuff, you're going to be dead.
That should be enough.
I mean, yeah, it's sort of like the FAFO, like management style. It's sort of Darwinism. Like, listen, if you don't understand how to handle cyanide, nature is just going to take you out of the equation. It's fine.
But the problem is that they also can take out other people.
This is it.
Unknowingly.
That's right.
That's
right. Cyanide can occur in both gaseous and crystal forms. The most frequent used form of the substance are sodium cyanide and potassium cyanide, the kind discovered in the Tylenol capsules. The country's largest cyanide manufacturer is the E285 de Nemours Co. in Wilmington, Delaware, which according to spokesman Edward Stewart produces, quote, in the millions of pounds of the chemical annually. That's too much cyanide. Stewart said DuPont has officials meet with any new cyanide customer to evaluate his understanding of the chemical. If we're not satisfied after that conversation that the person is qualified to use it, we refuse the order, Stewart said. Customers must also certify by letter that they understand the safety procedures necessary for handling cyanide. Most of DuPont's industrial customers are manufacturing and mining concerns who use the chemical as a catalyst to separate metals like gold and silver from raw ore, or use it in the electroplating process. One byproduct of the Chicago deaths may be increased political pressure to increase the regulation of such poisons. Senator Robert T. Stafford, Republican, Vermont, chairman of the Environment and Public Works Committee, late yesterday sent a letter to EPA Administrator Ann M. Gorsuch asking her to investigate the possibility of further regulation. Quote, clearly few persons could have anticipated that anyone would take the irrational and inhuman action which led to these deaths, Stafford's letter said. However, the action having nonetheless been taken, it is incumbent on you or some other official to determine the appropriate regulatory response for the control of cyanide in order to prevent a recurrence. End quote. That's a big article with a lot of information in it.
Yeah. And I find it so interesting that nothing ever changes and that it's always like, it's always been done like this. We don't need any more regulations. It's fine. We just tell them you are aware that this is really dangerous, right? Yeah,
I thought this was really interesting because Senator Stafford is a Republican and they are traditionally more hands-off, less government regulation, right? Like we discussed that in the water park episodes. So I think that speaks to how shaken people were by this occurrence because that feels like a rare thing to me.
Also interesting fact, the manufacturer you mentioned, the one that was mentioned in the article, DuPont de Nemours, that's the family of John DuPont, Foxcatcher DuPont.
Yeah.
Another not so fun fact, DuPont was one of the biggest environmental polluters in the US. They are linked to multiple industrial accidents, fatalities, and major lawsuits. The company has been fined millions, and they have also been labeled a severe violator by OSHA. So, not that it has anything to do with this case, I just found it interesting that DuPont would pop up here.
It is, I think, yeah. So that's the really, really terrible Tylenol poisonings. So many people have been excited that we were covering this. Now we should go watch the Netflix thing, see what we missed.
I started it yesterday evening, but it was already too late. And I have to admit, I turned it off after 10 minutes. And you know why?
Why?
There was one guy who was working with the investigators. He was like a chemist or something. And he was trying to explain potassium cyanide. And he said, like in spy movies where they bite down on the cyanide tablet
capsule.
And they die instantaneously or something like that. And that's exactly what I said last week. And then I was like, oh no, now everybody's going to think I watched this before and just copy whatever they said. So I turned it off because I was like, no, I can't take this.
No, I know that feeling. Because I often, once I've got all my research done, that's when I'll go in and listen to something or try to watch something to see if they found something I didn't. And it's stressful.
So it's going to be another couple of weeks, I think, before I kind of take up the courage again to watch the Netflix documentary.
I'll watch it. I don't care. I'll let you know.
Okay.
I know that feeling, though.
It's horrible.
Yeah. You know what's horrible? Can I just vent for a quick second right now can we just talk about how absolutely awful the air quality is right now? So we've had horrific thunderstorms, which is good. My lawn, my garden needs the rain, but it's been hot and humid. Like the humidity is disgusting. On top of that, now we're getting all the wildfire smoke from the Canadian wildfires have reached us. So, like, I can't breathe today. You're probably going to, when you're editing, you're going to hear me taking a lot of deep breaths, but it's like, it's hard to breathe today. And it's just, ugh. So shout out to everyone with like allergies and any kind of asthma. It's just gross, really gross.
Are we venting today?
We can.
Do we? Okay. I'm venting about grass.
Oh, girl, preach.
Guys, if you're in the Facebook group, you already know last week, Friday, I was in the house. Jem was outside in the garden and then I just heard him violently sneezing. And I mean, all dog sneezes are violent, but this was like 10 minutes of sneezing. So I ran outside and see what's happening because at first I thought maybe he got stung by a bee or a hornet even. It's my worst fear. And then he kind of calmed down and stopped sneezing. Nothing was swollen. I thought, oh, maybe some, flower pollen or something like this. And I thought, okay, everything is fine again. And then hours later, obviously after our regular vet had already closed, he started violently sneezing again and then blood came out of his nose. And I'm like, oh my God.
You sent me that video? I was like, is he sneezing blood? Because I thought I understood what I was seeing, but then I was like, no. And yes, sneezing blood, poor baby.
And so we rushed to the emergency vet clinic and they were like, well, did he eat already? And I'm like, yeah. So they said they can't put him under anesthesia and they have to put him under anesthesia. There's no other way. So we should come back the next day. And I'm like, okay. I knew it's going to be the grass seeds, like Annie said in the States or in English, some of them are called foxtails. We have really different kinds here, but it's the one with the little hooks that kind of can get under the skin or,
they're like
get
barbs.
into your...
They almost look like thorns and they'll go right through. Somebody was saying like they'll go... My sister in England deals with them. I know they're all over like the UK and I think we get them in Western states like Colorado and California. But knock wood, we do not have them here in New England.
And they can even go into the lungs and the brain and it's horrible. And so I asked, okay, but isn't there like the fear of them going into the lung? And they're like, yeah, but it's possible, but it's unlikely that this is going to happen. So, okay, I took him back home. He was sneezing the whole night. He could barely sleep. And then the next day, I took him to our regular vet and they were like, yeah, they can look into it, but they also have to put him under a full anesthesia and they don't have the equipment to go. If it's further back, they can't reach it. And then I have to go to the clinic and put him again under anesthesia. And that's not good for anyone, and especially with his Lafora. I'm like, yeah, we're not going to do that. So
no.
I waited until 1:00 in the afternoon and then I went to the clinic. They put him under anesthesia and they pulled out four seeds from his left nostril. And they were like, usually they pull out one. He had 4 stuck in there. Baby. So this event, but then also the something good is that we have a clinic nearby that everybody was super nice and super gentle with him because I told him he can't be you can't stress him out, please, because then he's going to have, another episode with his
Lafora
shaking and yeah.
Yeah.
Tremors.
I just want to
but now he's fine again.
Wrap him up and protect him. Like put him in a hamster bubble maybe for the garden.
Did you ever see Raising Hope?
Yes. With the pantyhose on the face.
The pantyhose.
I think that's the best idea.
I gotta do that with him.
Yeah. I told Paul that I wanted to start sleeping with pantyhose on my face so that spiders couldn't get into my ear at night. And he was just like, no, please no. And I'm like, well, if maybe. No, it's terrifying.
It is. Yeah.
I'm glad he's feeling better.
All right. I think that's
it for this episode of Fresh Hell. If you are still with us and have not yet yeeted every single bottle in your medicine cabinet into the trash, we thank you. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to rate and review Fresh Hell. It really, really helps new listeners find the show. Special shout out to MG Graft. Thank you. I'm so glad that you love our podcast. And also, hi, Tilda. Thank you for changing it to 5 stars. We so appreciate it. We appreciate you. So, thank you. If you would like to support what we do and get early access to our episodes, our full Cinema Macabre back catalog, and the occasional weird live hangout, head over to patreon.com/freshhellpodcast. We need to schedule our next hangout, don't we?
Yes. our June hangout.
It might already be out. It'll be out by the time you hear this. We'll have that date fixed.
You can find us at freshhellpodcast.com for all the links. We're also on Facebook. Just search for Fresh Hell Podcast. You'll find a private group full of the loveliest weirdos you can imagine, and then a page that will give you updates on episode. Also, shout out to Marissa's student who used Annie's episode on Kate Warren for her presentation. Which is amazing.
Totally made my day. Yeah, a history teacher in our group reached out because one of her kids did a presentation and used our podcast as a source. So,
and she didn't recommend us or tell her to do that. She just was completely taken by surprise when she heard Annie's voice.
Makes me so happy. I love it.
Yeah,
it's funny because when I was young, I didn't like history very much as a topic. It was a lot of memorization of dates and a lot of geography that I sort of struggled to get my head around. And now as an adult, I can't get enough. And so I love being able to present things in different ways that have sort of different interesting facts that maybe your teachers would not have mentioned. You know?
I loved history. It was my favorite subject. History, geography, art history, music history. History is just everything for me.
Yeah.
And I hope it comes across that way.
It does. It absolutely does. Yeah. If you want to say hi to us, you can always email us at freshhellpodcast@gmail.com. Or if you're feeling truly vintage, send us a postcard or whatever you want to our P.O. box. And you'll also find all of that information on freshhellpodcast.com.
That's it. Please tell your pets we said hi. Hug them, cuddle them, check them for foxtail seeds. Take them to the vet if necessary. Be kind to them. Be kind to your fellow human being. And also important, don't forget about yourself. Be kind to yourself.
And as Winston Churchill once famously said during World War II, if you're going through hell,
keep going. Tschüss.
Bye.